Well, as Dr. Habil Olaka retires from the Kenya's Bankers Association of Kenya, he recalls one of his biggest regrets at the helm of the banking industry in the country. Even as he charts his way forward, Olaka, who was in the shortlist of the CBK Deputy Governor's role applicants, speaks about the status of Pan-African banking, the banking industry, and why Kenya is yet to combat money laundering. KTN's Esther Diana caught up with him and brings us this exclusive interview. Take a look.
Thank you very much for taking your time to speak to us and having us here today. So I'd like to understand, early this year, your retirement from the Kenya Bankers Association was announced, and thereafter you also exited your active role as the president of the Federation of Employers. So how does this make you feel, and is this how you pictured retirement?
Well, I think first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I think for me, when I look at my time at the KBA, I'd been there for about 14 years by the time I was retiring in March 2024. And if I look back when I joined KBA, I think I'm fairly proud of what we achieved in the banking sector. You mentioned about the employers as well. It may have been a coincidence that the time when I was retiring from KBA, which was 31st of March, I stepped down as the national president of FKE about 3 months later in June. But I remain on the board.
So when you look back at your work life, would you say you have any regrets? What are some of the things you regret?
It's difficult because, sometimes it comes with hindsight. There were, for example, things that we did not quite get as well as we should have gotten. And from that perspective, yes, you can say regrets because then there would have been a better way of doing it. One of them is, for example, you remember there was a time when there was an interest capping law. And there were 4 attempts actually during my time. And of the 4, 2 went through. The other 2 did not go through. And then finally, the one that went through by Honorable Jordan Jomo, it did not, it almost caught us by surprise. You see, we did not think it was going to go through, but eventually it got through because the mood in the country, and especially with the legislature, was such that teach them a lesson. But the effect of that law was so significant on the economy. The impact of it was so significant on the economy. One, central bank was not able to conduct its monetary policy effectively. The people who are meant to have been benefiting from the law as it was passed were the SMEs, were the ones who suffered most out of the law. So I think now with hindsight, we possibly could have been a little bit more proactive and tried to ensure that we do a bit more to try to dissuade the MPs with facts and reasoning from the fact that, going that route would have generated the kind of challenges that we have finally met.
Can you speak to us about Pan-African banking and where is Kenya as a country? Have we made strides with regards to Pan-African banking, payment and settlement systems?
We are very proud of the fact that our banks are very outgoing. If you look at the Kenyan banks, for example, especially the major players, they are looking at trying to take up the market that is out there. East African, for example, they are not just Kenyan, but they are trying to move out to take advantage of the market that has been created by virtue of the EAC as an industry, as a region. And so using Kenya as a base to set up in East Africa. But I think there are a number of Kenyan banks that are actually beginning to flow out there, and therefore becoming Pan-African banks rather than just regional or Kenyan banks per se. And also the other factor is the fact that a number of them are now beginning to look at the Africa as a market rather than Kenya or East Africa for that matter. So initially it was Kenya, then expanding to East Africa to take advantage of the East African market. And now many of them are now looking beyond East Africa. And I think Kenyan banks are very well placed to play in that Pan-African banking space. And they can actually be the leaders in that space because they have got the capacity, they have got the structures, they have got the leadership structures in place, the leadership capacity in place, they have got the size. Because for you to be able to play at that level, you must have the right size in terms of capitalization, in terms of asset base, in terms of expertise across the region.
So I remember like early or rather late last year, there was a conversation or rather a proposal to have one currency across the Africa region and most especially the East African region. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it is a good idea. The problem is the actualization, because there are a number of hiccups that you have got to overcome. First of all, the convergence of the various economic parameters amongst the countries. For them to actually come into a monetary union, there is quite a bit that needs to be done. And it's normally not an easy thing because it consumes a lot of energy, it requires a lot of coordination, and there's a lot of political will that is required amongst the players. And normally getting that political will is the biggest problem. There is some good in terms of going into the union, but there's normally a pain in terms of losing some bit of control, and sometimes the political will may not just be forthcoming.
All right, so Kenya is one of the biggest economies in Africa. However, there's been a lot of issues surrounding the issue of money laundering. So then from where you sit, what would you say is the problem? Why is Kenya finding it difficult to counter money laundering?
That's a good question. You know, currently we are in what we call the grey listed countries by the Financial Action Task Force. And before we went in, there were some very strategic deficiencies that they were concerned about our inability to address them, and that's why they were putting us into that grey list. At that point in time, there were two key things. One of them was the fact that we do not have a financial reporting center. For a financial reporting center to be put in place, it was just purely political will. When it became, critical, and we were actually being threatened to be put in the blacklist, and the impact on things like, for example, the banking sector was going to be dire, because it means you cannot transact with your correspondent banks and everything when you are blacklisted. Eventually, we are again grey-listed. So we are now back where we were some years back through the same process. And it's a very tedious, painful exercise of trying to go there every so often to defend and explain what you have done on each of the deficiencies.
Even as technology encroaches deeper into the banking halls, what are some of the investment banks are making, or would you recommend banks to make with regards to combating the risks that come with technological advancements?
Yeah, I think they are... okay, first of all, I think I totally agree with you in terms of the fact that in order to meet the wants and the conveniences of the customer, banks will have to leverage on technology to be able to provide those conveniences, to provide those wants, and also to bring their costs down as a bank institution. So you'll have to leverage on technology. And one of the critical ones is actually cybersecurity. Because when you start playing into that space, you expose yourself to those risks. As much as you're trying to develop your technology to be able to enthuse your customer, to be able to provide convenience to the customer, these cyber criminals are also inventing and are also developing their systems almost at the same pace as you are. You put investment into it, you put research into it, they're also putting investment and research into it. So you have got therefore to invest also significantly in cybersecurity systems. You've got to invest significantly in the human resource capacity, because this technology is actually manned by humans. The second one, which we touched on a little bit earlier, is the banking system can easily be used to launder money. You see, and especially now with the technology, funds could flow through so easily through the system without any, initially there were the physical, checks and barriers, but now you can have funds flowing through our system quite easily. And therefore, you need to invest into the system to ensure that you can be able to detect money that is being laundered. You can be able to detect financing of terrorism through the system. You can be able to detect what they call proliferation financing. You can be able to detect all those avenues that can be used through the banking sector to cause harm.
As we conclude this conversation, what are some of the skills that are most sought after in the banking sector right now?
Actually, and just following on to what you have just discussed about, I think especially compliance. Compliance is becoming a major area for the banking sector, and compliance can be fairly wide. Compliance in terms of complying with the regulatory requirements, and the regulatory requirements are trying to come into place to put in place requirements that that safeguard you against those risks. So
well, that interview, of course, there between our very own Esther Diana and Dr. Habil Olaka. He is on the short list running for Deputy Governor of the Central Bank. And that brings us to the end of this conversation here on Business Today. Up next.